You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C. And my regular co-host, Katie Putz, is off on vacation this week, so I'm actually delighted to have back on a familiar voice to many of you who listen. Sebastian Strangio, the Diplomats Southeast Asia editor, joins me today. Sebastian, it's been too long, but it's really a pleasure to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be back, Ankit.
And Sebastian, I'm particularly glad to have you back since today we'll be addressing a topic that several listeners have emailed me and DM'd me on Twitter about in the last several weeks, which is an update on the situation in Myanmar. And of course, we'd scheduled this podcast a week in advance, but unfortunately, the timing of our recording coincides with some really bleak news out of the country. The junta announced that 4 democracy activists had been executed, which has drawn a sharp rebuke from around the region. So maybe we can begin our conversation there and then talk a little bit more broadly about the international diplomacy around Myanmar, which the context here, of course, is that we are nearing the 18-month anniversary on the 1st of August of the early 2021 coup d'etat, which has thrown the country into a complex, fractured insurgency as the Tatmadaw, or the Burmese military, looks to consolidate its power. But Sebastian, enough for me. Tell us a bit about these executions. First of all, why were these carried out? What does the junta hope to gain here? Is this about internal signaling, or is this sort of, basically giving the outside world the proverbial finger, so to speak? Why exactly would they do this?
Well, when they announced these executions last month, there was some speculation that perhaps this was a bargaining chip that they would seek to use in their dealings with ASEAN or with the wider outside world. It now appears that assessment was misplaced. It seems that this is really a brute act of intimidation designed to cow the Myanmar public into silence and acquiescence. The junta's decision to execute these 4 political prisoners, which include a member of the ousted National League for Democracy government, a lawmaker for that government, and another high-profile political activist who took part in the 1988 uprising against military rule as well. The fact that they've done this, this has displayed an absolute contempt not only for global opinion, but also for the opinion of Myanmar's neighbors in ASEAN. Prime Minister Hun Sen, who holds the rotating chair of ASEAN this year, made a personal plea in a letter to Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the junta, last month. And this is also, the executions also take place just a week before a series of high-profile ASEAN meetings in Phnom Penh. So, I think that the indifference that the junta has shown toward international and regional opinion is a sign to me that the motivation for these things is purely to intimidate the Myanmar public, and to cow to drive ordinary people away from the resistance.
Mm-hmm. So the reactions from around the region have been strong. As you noted, Cambodia holds the ASEAN chairmanship right now, and they released a chairman's statement on the execution of the 4 opposition activists, calling it highly reprehensible, which, by ASEAN standards is fairly strong language indeed. We have similar reactions from around the region, including from Malaysia, which called the executions a mockery of ASEAN's peace plan for Myanmar. What do you make of the regional response, and do you think this will actually move the needle at all on how ASEAN approaches Myanmar over the coming weeks and months as Cambodia looks to round out its year as chair?
Well, the executions were really a slap in the face to the Cambodian government. Again, as I mentioned, Hun Sen had made a personal plea. Min Aung Hlaing has totally ignored that. They've also chosen to do this at a time, when ASEAN is gearing up for, a large, a series of high-profile meetings. They couldn't, the timing couldn't have been worse in terms of embarrassing and, frankly, insulting ASEAN. So if there's anything that's going to move, it's also a mockery of ASEAN's sort of the ASEAN way, this sort of consensus-based, slow, process-based diplomacy aimed at sort of moving things, keeping channels of dialogue open and sort of really foregrounding, continued consultations. It makes a mockery of that. It makes a mockery of the 5-point consensus that ASEAN agreed last April, which, the junta has made a mockery of that since it was agreed. But this is a particularly egregious violation of both the spirit and letter of the 5-point consensus. So if there's anything that's going to push ASEAN to toughen its position on Myanmar and even carve out an exception to its operating principles of non-interference, this might well be it. The question, though, is, what is likely to happen? Assuming that ASEAN can muster the necessary consensus is always that it's never something that can be assumed, because all it takes is one member state to sort of hold up proceedings. But even if they can establish some kind of unity, like how they can effectively punish Myanmar, Myanmar's junta, a government that's really shown it has no concern for the opinion of other countries. It views itself as sort of a besieged, virtuous vanguard, I suppose, of Myanmar's national interest. And so, one thing that the Malaysian foreign minister suggested, I think in an interview yesterday, was that, ASEAN could potentially exclude the junta's representatives from any meeting of ASEAN, including ministerial level meetings, which
do you think
previously
happen?
it had only excluded. Yeah. But, beyond that, it's, this is really a test of ASEAN's, way of doing business. I mean, normally, ASEAN, sanctions are not really in its diplomatic vocabulary. Expelling a member and threatening, the kind of cohesion and unity of the bloc is also something that appears to be, a bridge too far at the moment still. Mm-hmm. So really, whether this extends beyond superlatives and expressions of concern is, really remains to be seen. I predict that there probably will be some toughening, but whether that's meaningful in any way and whether that actually moves the needle on, the junta's political calculations, is hard to say at this point in time.
So whenever we talk about ASEAN, the C word, consensus, is always front and center. I believe, you used it when you were describing the conditions that would be necessary for ASEAN to take action on Myanmar. If you look around at the other 9 ASEAN members, which country do you see as the most likely to potentially inhibit strong ASEAN action on Myanmar? Or is there a fair sense that consensus does exist or likely will manifest in a way necessary to bring ASEAN around on this issue?
Well, the Cambodians have typically been pretty hostile to the idea of, interfering in other nations' affairs. Obviously, they have their own sensitivities about that due to their relations with the West and Western democracy promotion efforts dating back the last few decades. But the fact that the junta has basically poked the Cambodian government in the eye with these executions and really embarrassed it may make Cambodia much more open to a harder line. And so I don't think the Cambodians are going to be the greatest holdouts in terms of a harder line on Myanmar. Probably Vietnam and Laos, 2 countries that, really can be spoken to, of in the same breath, given their very, very close alignment of political alignment. And they've been, I haven't seen any statements from either of them. I haven't really looked about the, so they may have put out statements about the executions. But, these 2 countries, have been very hostile to the idea of sort of a stronger ASEAN line. They've been fairly quiet about it since the beginning. But, it also, these are nations that also voted, have voted against, I believe, the UN Human Rights Council resolution that expelled Russia from the council, and have been have adopted similar positions toward the Russia-Ukraine war. Mm-hmm. And so I would predict that they would probably be the main holdouts. But who knows? I mean, this. I do think that the Vietnamese in particular see ASEAN as having some value, and it's possible that, people have said that ASEAN's credibility is on the line since the coup happened last February. It could be that sense of ASEAN itself, coming under existential threat may be the thing that moves nations like Vietnam, across to the other side. But It's very hard to know what to do with a country that
Right.
displays a near total indifference to regional and global opinion. I mean, what do you do?
Right. Before we move ahead, Sebastian, I just wanted to tell our listeners a little bit about our sponsor for this episode. Quarterly Essay is Australia's leading journal of politics, culture, and debate. Their latest issue, Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America, by Hugh White, explores Australia's fateful choice to back America to the hilt and oppose China. White assesses America's credibility and commitment by examining AUKUS, the Quad, Trump, and Biden. He discusses what the Ukraine conflict tells us about the future and argues that the U.S. can neither contain China nor win a war over Taiwan. For over 20 years, Quarterly Essay has been at the forefront of political discussion, publishing award-winning essays from outstanding writers, journalists, and commentators. Use promo code DIPLOMAT to take 20% off an ebook or print copy of this original essay by Australia's leading strategic thinker. Read more at quarterlyessay.com.au. Back to it, Sebastian. Okay, the next thing I wanted to ask you about was, July 2022. This month began with a visit to Myanmar by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, which the Tatmadaw sort of cited as a recognition, of its legitimacy. China's role, I think, has been fascinating, with sort of, support for the junta on the one hand, but also accusations by the Tatmadaw that Chinese arms are going to certain armed groups in northern Myanmar, so on and so forth. What's your sense of China's role right now, in Myanmar, and in sort of promoting this process? China has also sort of positioned itself alongside ASEAN in sort of encouraging Myanmar to sort of restart the transition process and sort of return power to the people. If you sort of read the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement, so there's a contradiction on the one hand there, but I'd be very curious for your take on the Chinese role in Myanmar at the moment.
Well, I think initially it was sort of damage control. I don't think the Chinese were, contrary to rumor, aware that this coup was going to happen, and I think they were quite shocked by it. I think there's a certain frustration in Chinese policymaking circles with the dysfunction of Myanmar politics, with the conflict, with the instability that engenders, and the difficulty that this poses for the fulfillment of long-standing Chinese strategic goals in the country, such as sort of opening an infrastructure corridor from Yunnan province to the Indian Ocean. I think fairly quickly, within 4 or 5 months, the Chinese government had made a fairly frank and brute assessment that the Myanmar military would prevail, and they began to restore relations with the military junta and sort of pick up the pieces, as it were. That has really continued to the present. There's been, much more. Yeah, there's been, the visit by the foreign minister was just the latest sign of many that, that the Chinese are making a very pragmatic assessment that, the military junta is likely to emerge victorious, and that China its strategic interests are best served by, normalizing relations and restoring, good ties to the extent that it can. It probably also sees some strategic benefit in the fact that Myanmar is once again isolated from the West, and so therefore it enjoys pole position, I suppose, in the country, as it did prior to 2011, when the country began its program of political opening. And so, yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see, if the situation continues to deteriorate, how much pressure China is willing to put on the Myanmar military. I think that the Chinese probably are, they see all of these Western nations lining up with expressions of concern, meeting with the national unity government and so forth. And I think that they, knowing, the sort of paranoia of the Chinese leadership, I think they probably view all of these things as, as motivated in part by sort of an anti-China, there being an anti-China motivation to a lot of this, and they're concerned that more open Western support for the opposition will threaten China's interests in the country, and that is probably also motivating their increasing, dealings with the junta. But if things continue to deteriorate, it will be interesting to see if China sort of applies meaningful pressure on the military regime to come to terms with its opponents. But right now, it seems very willing to play along with the military's perception or framing of the conflict as one between a legitimate government seeking order and stability and bands of terrorists seeking to undermine its control.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to ask you is one of the ideas that's popular here in Washington is the imposition of sanctions on the energy sector in Myanmar, which is one of the areas where the junta continues to seek, revenue for its ongoing campaigns against the various insurgent groups around the country. What's your take on this? And could you talk a little bit about the role of Thailand in particular? Because I think that's been interesting, and it sort of comes up, the nature of sort of Thai economic engagement with Myanmar, particularly on the energy side. Do you think that this is an avenue worth pursuing, or is this sort of a misguided idea overall in the effect that it's likely to have on the junta?
Yeah, well, since the coup, activists have been calling for sanctions on the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, which is probably the leading source of revenue for the military. And one of the main sort of international partners of MOG is Thai. I think the PTT, the Thai oil and gas company, and this gas created. Myanmar gas, produces electricity for the Thai market. And so, any sanctioning by the US government of this entity would also affect a huge number of households in Western Thailand. And I think my understanding of the politics of this is that US policymakers are very cautious about pulling that trigger because it would potentially worsen quite significantly relations with Thailand at a time when the US-Thai relationship is, wouldn't say in a bad state, but certainly in a state of stagnation and drift.
Right.
And so, that there's sort of a strategic concern there. I think the moral case for sanctioning MOG is very clear, but the sort of after effects that it might have on the broader U.S. relationship with Thailand is something that policymakers are weighing in the balance.
Yeah, and amid broader economic headwinds for the Thai economy as well, like so many economies around the world right now, dealing with inflation, so on and so forth. This would be
of course similar, in some ways to the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia that have really created economic shockwaves around the world. And then there's this sort of question of how far do you weaponize this interdependence, and how far do you let the negative economic impacts run before it starts to undermine sort of your broader strategic position. And I do think that in some ways there's limits to how far Western governments can go. You can cut off all economic intercourse with the Myanmar junta. You can isolate it completely from international financial networks. They have been here before, so it's not as if that they can't survive that sort of isolation. The next step from there would be to offer concrete as opposed to rhetorical support for the national unity government and the various forces seeking to unseat the Myanmar military. And this, I think this is also a popular idea amongst, at least, in my Twitter timeline, I see a lot of people advocating this sort of support. And I suppose the danger here, or it would be a very significant Rubicon to cross. I think to offer substantial material, even military support for the resistance would commit Western governments to a revolutionary transformation of Myanmar's politics, which is precisely what the NUG's agenda is. It is not seeking simply a return to the status quo ante. It is seeking the creation of a new status quo in which the military plays a very, very small role in Myanmar's politics and is subordinated to civilian control. The creation of a federal democracy, something that would resolve a lot of the ethnic fissures that have complicated the country's history since independence. This is a huge project that potentially will involve a very bloody struggle on the part of the resistance forces.
Yeah. So as we close out the discussion, I wanted to ask you sort of probably the toughest question, which is, I know it's quite difficult to make heads or tails of the very complex insurgency environment within Myanmar. We've talked about some of the the main parties, the Tatmadaw, the NUG, but you have the ethnic armed organizations around the country as well, who for tactical or strategic reasons are partnering with either the military or the NUG and then you have sort of, groups that are really out for themselves. Looking at the landscape of sort of insurgency within Myanmar, are there any clear trends that sort of jump out to you with regard to the direction of the conflict? We're at the 18-month mark now since the coup. By the 24-month mark, by the 2-year mark, where do you think we'll be with regard to the actual internal situation? Will things look basically just as bad as they do right now, or do you think the military will actually be able to consolidate some advances? As you hinted, perhaps the Chinese assessment might suggest the military is actually perhaps positioned better than some might think in terms of consolidating its grip on power.
It's really difficult to say. You do see rosy takes coming out of the National Unity Government and also sympathetic observers in the West that that the military is on its last legs. It's having difficult finding recruits. It's stretched thin across the country and is, really, even in its traditional heartlands in central Myanmar is facing, huge, nearly universal popular resistance, as well as increasingly effective armed resistance from civilian militia groups. It's really hard to say. I mean, to cut through the fog of war, which is particularly thick in a place like Myanmar, where you have so many overlapping insurgent groups and ethnic armed organizations and civilian militias that are, loyal to the National Unity Government, but, not entirely under its control. It's incredibly hard to say. I mean, my sense is that the military is facing increasing degrees of armed resistance, and that, things are becoming increasingly tenuous. But what I've heard of assessments of the Myanmar military and its internal culture is that it's very unlikely that you're going to see, mass defections and a collapse of the army from within. However, I'm not enough of an expert to rule that out. I mean, I have seen some experts begin to reassess their early takes on the likelihood of the Myanmar military being defeated. And, there have been some reassessments to the effect that actually, things are a little bit more uncertain now than they seemed a year ago. But frankly, there's so much, there's such sort of, a lack of information or such a diversity of information. It's very hard to synthesize and very hard to get a sense of actually what's going on, especially since a lot of that information is coming from sources that are sympathetic to the resistance and for understandable reasons want to paint its progress and to highlight its progress and to present things in a more optimistic light.
Absolutely. Well, I asked you a tough and unfair question, and you gave me a pretty nuanced answer, so I appreciate that. But any closing thoughts, Sebastian, before we end our discussion?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting to see. I think one thing that the Myanmar opposition is struggling with a little bit is the fickleness of international attention. You have an event that happens, and it captures the international headlines for a month or two. But then inevitably there comes along something else which sweeps it to the side, and I think that there's a good deal of cynicism now on social media accounts that I follow of people within Myanmar and activists within Myanmar about these kind of constant Western expressions of concern and anguish about what's happening in the country. That there's this sense that there's sort of a ritualistic quality to a lot of this, and that a lot of people look at what the U.S. and other Western countries are doing to support Ukraine, and they make the point that even a tiny fraction of what Ukraine is getting would be of huge benefit to the Myanmar population. Now, as I said before, that carries a lot of risks, but there is this sort of perception that the West is all talk and no action when it comes to supporting democracy and human rights abroad. And I think it'll be very interesting to see if the situation continues to worsen, whether that changes. But as it stands, in 6 months' time, I don't think we're going to be looking at a significantly different landscapes to what we are now. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope things improve. I hope there is a breakthrough of some kind. But unfortunately, the trend lines are not looking good.
Yeah, no, I mean, your closing thought there on the fickleness of international attention was something that I also heard when I had a brief chance to interact with a few Burmese delegates at the Shangri-La dialogue, obviously, who were watching events elsewhere, including Ukraine, quite closely. I think it speaks to, at least when it comes to the West's engagement with this part of the world, the importance of geopolitics, right? The United States treats Ukraine and Myanmar as completely different crises for precisely the reasons that U.S. national interests diverge, which is something that I think is difficult and frustrating for people wishing for a more active U.S. response there.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Sebastian, thank you so much for joining me today and really helping all of our listeners make sense of the situation in Myanmar. It's great to have you back on, and I'm sure it won't be too long before you're back on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
For listeners, if you like what you heard on the show and you want more, make sure you subscribe so you can see future episodes as they come out. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. You can do that anywhere you get your podcasts, and we really appreciate it. It helps the show grow. And as always, like I said at the beginning, this episode was brought to you partly due to listener interest. So if you have any particular subjects that you would like to see covered on the podcast, please reach out to me by email or on Twitter. I'd be very happy to take those recommendations into account as we plan future episodes. Thanks a lot for listening.